online and we're trying to have this conversation. Take 3. Oh, Lord. So you were talking about being a nurse in Jamaica. Let's pick it up from there.
Yeah.
That's where we started to get cut
Being
off.
a nurse in Jamaica, I was very aware that student nurses, were the ones who were very much involved in running the hospital,
Right.
University of the West Indies, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And in that realization, I began to question or decide that I could be a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And according to this thing, you muted the call. According to this gadget you have, Nihanda has muted this call.
Well, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. But it said Nihanda muted this call. Anyway, do I go ahead?
Yes, because if you can hear me and I can hear you,
good.
then that's all that matters.
So then in this time now, I began to challenge the behavior of the medical system without necessarily identifying the fact that I was doing that, you know. I just moved from my gut and my belly. And this is a point that I want to make concerning my reflections now on women's movement and women's organizing, right?
Right.
Meaning that I begin to give language or put language to what it means to be a woman, which I would not have had that language at that time. You know, I was more moving by instinct with a lot of the things that I was doing.
Okay.
So, looking back now on the women's movement, I'm beginning to try to sift out those issues that were instinctive and those things that were intentional and align and see why they were so. That make sense?
Why they were so what?
Why it was being expressed in that way.
Okay.
You know, so by that I mean there are some things that were intentional and there were some things that were instinctive.
Mm-hmm.
And they did not necessarily balance off or harmonize as such, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, instinctively, I could see that we were running the hospital, and therefore, if we were running the hospital, then we should be given the position and the remuneration. So that was not necessarily about, I am a woman, and therefore, as a woman, I need to get the same rights as a man. That's not where that was coming from. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And same thing with the women's organizing in Belize, where it was a strategic decision previous to the independence of Belize, when we as women were seeing that young men especially were being identified as the ones to be incarcerated or held up during our independence movement, that we as women decided that we would step into the position of leading and organizing the national movement, which was distinct from the women's movement, even though it might come together, you understand?
Right.
So we were basically covering or protecting or standing in the gap for the men because they were more vulnerable, and not necessarily that, well, I as a woman have the right to be doing the same things that men can do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's a distinction that I'm beginning to reflect on even more, which is very important in the so-called developing countries, as distinct from the other countries.
Right. I was just going to ask you, like, how how are there similarities, or let's not say differences, but gaps between the women's movement in the Caribbean as opposed to what happened in the United States, for example, and in Europe? What are some of the distinctions? You just mentioned one of them being that you that women were concerned for their men, but
Right.
and so the two things kind of merge together as we move from a colony to an independent country. How do you see similarities and differences with that in comparison to what happened in the United States, which was around the same time, correct? A little bit.
That's a good point. That's a very good question, because it brings forth the fact that it's important to look at what's happening in different countries with women in different historical times. So whilst in the colonized or the countries where people were being enslaved, it was said that women could work up to the point of their pregnancy. In England or Europe or the United States, women were not allowed to work. And I said that by work, I mean like work outside the home. That's a distinction we need to look at.
Right.
So it's very interesting to note that contradiction, you know? And so even the women in the United States and Europe were aligning with the abolitionist movement, for example, because in the law books of these colonies, these countries, colonizers, women were just like the enslaved, categorized as property, like chattel, you know, like in the law books, a man had permission to beat his wife because she was listed as property, you know? And so it's very interesting to look at the conversation in the context of what happens in the different countries in the same historical period. So in the women's movement, this is something that we trace, like, for example, midwifery, right, and birthing of children. That women were called witches. Women in the European countries who were midwives had to do it in secret, because that control that a woman had over her body was something that became institutionalized, and midwifery at that time period would have threatened institutionalization of the medical practice. So all that knowledge that women had, especially about plants and herbs and medicines and so on, had to be done quietly and underground. So if we fast forward to this time period now, it is now becoming very trendy and popular.
Right.
You know that, you know, so we're in different parts of the world, like in the south of the United States, midwives were banned, like, you know, in the late, from the 30s, 1930s, and even up to this day. It's just coming back now that natural birth and natural birthing and all these new titles are being put to what had been there long ago, which was underground. And as you know, in Germany, it's, you know, part of the medical outreach where birthing at home is encouraged or it's practiced. And so I just like to have the conversation and not having like a blanket statement about the women's movement, because it seems to adjust in different parts, you know. Like now, I was like so amazed about a couple of weeks ago that there's this campaign here in the United States for midwives. Oh my goodness. The Kellogg Foundation is funding this training of midwives or reactivation of the midwifery program, and I'm like, wow, this is incredible. When I had my last child, as you are aware,
Mm-hmm.
in New Orleans, I had to sneak my midwife into the hospital
Mm-hmm.
and disguise her as like a family friend
Right,
accompanying me.
right, right.
So I am very careful in discussing women's movement to highlight these nuances that exist in different parts of the world, and also the capacity of the woman to be aware of her own self and her own being and her own life and do what she needs to do. You know, so like, for example, Harriet Tubman for the Underground Railroad
Mm-hmm.
was a woman who freed many people from enslavement. But she did not do that by herself. She did that by engaging with a whole set of people from different cultures, including the Quakers, you know. So I'm looking at movement as not unilateral or just, one set of people, but people interacting with each other, aligning for what is basic human right. Like a lot of people were upset with Nelson Mandela when after apartheid and he became president, he included many of the same whites who were part of this situation in his government, you know? So because he's looking at humanity and the deterioration of human behavior to each other. So this is how I am really reflecting on the women's movement quite a bit now. And as you rightfully said earlier on, it's not about differences and similarities, but beginning to identify those different characteristics of the movement that show up, you know?
Right. And as we start to talk about the similarities in how the women's movement has affected, the title is How the Women's Movement Affected the Way We Live Today. Looking back in your participation, I know we've talked before about things like um, breastfeeding, and you mentioned with midwifery and how that has taken a full 180 turn in terms of where we were and where we are.
Yeah.
Can you speak to, because it's a lot of information for this generation as to why this came about? And as I started to do a little bit more talking with people from the baby boomer generation, I've been finding out that like what happened in America, which is what I'm also seeing in places like Germany and places like Belize, where there is somewhat of a social system where there is so much encouragement for women to get their education, to get out of domestic violence situations, to take control of their finances. As an active participant in making those movements being brought to the forefront, you and I have had this conversation many times where we talk about where are the men in these conversations, right? And having more male participation and what empowering women does for the community on the other end of the spectrum. Can you speak more to that?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it also has to do with what you had mentioned earlier in another session about rites of passage and cultures, you know.
Right.
And I remember organizing with indigenous women, Maya.
Right. Okay.
Coming from another culture, I would go into the Maya communities and have this judgment Like the Maya women were backward, or because the men would walk ahead of them and they would walk behind, you know?
Wow.
And the interpretation from the other culture, my culture, and others, is that the men were leaving the women behind. But as I began to engage more with the Maya women, I realized that there was wisdom in what was doing. The man was protecting, taking the front line, so to speak, because of what might have been impending danger going through the landscape, you know?
Right.
So I began to be more sensitive about generalizing about people's way of being, women way of being, because of the lens that I was looking through, you know?
Right.
Hello?
Yes, right. I hear you.
And then I remember once visiting a Maya village and discovering that the lady who we were looking for was having her baby. She and her husband had gone to the river, and he was delivering the baby. And then learned that after baby was born, father stayed home and took care of baby and mother. So also that men were midwives in these indigenous communities. So it's very, very enlightening to begin to look at and to begin to be aware, you know, of people's way of being and people's way of doing things. And that doesn't deny that movement is not necessary, or that there are not discrepancies,
right?
But to have the sensitivity on how to deal with these discrepancies based on the geographic situation. So there's a lady who wrote, Dr. Nawal Sadawi. She wrote the book The Hidden Face of Eve, which speaks to the issue of female circumcision, right? And I went to a meeting of African women in Dakar, Senegal, and these women were very concerned about the analysis of women from the West, of their experience in Africa.
Okay.
And it's not that these women in Africa were promoting female circumcision, but what they were concerned about was that the women of the West, or people of the West, do not have the sensitivity to articulate the nuances of that reality for them, and essentially they could make the situation worse by their intervention.
Right. That brings up a good point, because when I read there's a book out on a study of lower income and middle income families that was done in the United States around the time that we lived there, and the name of the book is called gosh, I cannot remember the name of the book. Promises I can keep. Why poor or middle income women choose motherhood over marriage. And as we started to talk about marriage as a social contract between two individuals, which almost functions like a business contract, and you know how we have shifted from being property to partners, and I use that term quite loosely because when we speak of equality, these are some of the cultural nuances that we're speaking about, right? What are some of the rules that are important for society to function? And what are some of the gender rules and how we have blurred those lines, much to our disadvantage in some cases? And that's what the book speaks to. So in the United States, quite similarly to the situation in South Africa with the hidden face of Eve, she talks about how we don't want to go off of two different paradigms where there is sort of like an imbalance of quote unquote power, because women are women in this particular situation and study were trying to maintain cultural power over how children are raised and through financial independence. But realistically speaking, I don't know what the statistics are in Belize, but in America, this marriage as a social contract is really important, not just for the stability of the upbringing of children, um, but it is also important for retirement of women, because what we're seeing is that a lot, there are way more bag ladies and women who are, so to speak, dying alone or becoming dependent on family because they, for whatever reason, are not in a family way. They've raised their children as with very little income, so there is no supplementation of a two-parent household where they're able to raise retirement funding to retire comfortably, therefore leaving the single mother um, as a burden to her family to take care of later on. So um, this all took place because women were choosing to raise their children on their own instead of staying with their mate, or staying with the person that they chose to have children with. Um, so when you talk about if you were to speak to a woman from South Africa who were you know looking at the Western women as, okay, this is may probably a bad idea, that was the first thing that came to mind. That when you say something like, I don't want a man, I don't need a man, I want a man, it's not covering. That to me says like a conversation that is unilateral. Is that the correct term? To speak without enough information in a way that doesn't address all of the issues as to what men bring to the table. Can you speak to that a little bit more as to why men are important in having this conversation? I know you mentioned midwifery and protection. I would like to throw in there sort of a social order. You know, um, Men bring a lot of structure to the family way, um, but I'd like for you to speak more on that.
Well, um, the more I travel, the more I am learning that to be careful with making generalizations, and
Right.
that's not to say that we mustn't come up with some paradigms or guidelines,
Mm-hmm.
but I think like this, I always say to women, and I say to myself, that I don't like this terminology about being a single parent,
Mm-hmm.
because that essentially is not. I know what is being alluded to,
Mm-hmm.
but um, and you helped me a lot when you were talking about the rites of passage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the the world is defined by structures and systems. So, like, if I want to see, let's say I'm not taking care of my children, somebody's going to take care of them in some shape or form. And even when the children are at home, well, pre-COVID, they would go to a place called school,
Mm-hmm.
where the teacher would be like a surrogate mother or father. They're spending more hours with the children than we,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so I really want to present that fact and really to unpack that some more.
Mm-hmm.
There are also, like, if you go to church or if they go to Sunday school or whatever ritual the children are put into, there are different contributors to this upbringing of children and the rites of passage. So it has to do with what I shared with you earlier of how I myself begin to articulate and to begin to give language and to begin to be more sensitive to things that happen in my journey that I was not as sensitive to as I am now. And a lot of it has to do with those things that are instinctive and those things that are intentional. So moving forward in identifying what the instincts and what the gifts are available, then that puts more resources available to one if you don't take it for granted, so to speak. So like as a quick example, I was asking myself, why is it my sense of the world is so expanded? And then I realized something that I had not acknowledged, and that was that as a child, I traveled from Canada to Belize by road. That would definitely give me a sense of a world that even though I might have taken it for granted, once I took note of it, realized that, that's a powerful gift and capacity that I needed to be more intentional and embrace some more, as I am a grandmother and a mother, and speak to it not like matter of fact, oh well, we traveled from Canada to Belize by road, and just gloss over it. So I am calling women to gloss over things less, things that they may seem very small, but they are they're very unique. For example, the fact that I went to study in Europe because there were two women who are not from my cultural orientation, but these women identified and facilitated my going to Europe is very significant. These women from the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation in New York, which is a totally different cultural orientation from mine, had the visioning and they saw the need for capacity building for me from the Caribbean to cross the Atlantic Ocean,
I just hang on a second.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
In looking at the women's movement, I'm looking at the intentionality and the instincts. I believe that those women who reach out to me from the United States in their intentionality were also moving by instinct. And at that time, if you want to talk about women who didn't have any children at that time, but certainly they saw that I, who had a child, I had one child at that time, would have been very instrumental or very significant in organizing of the women's movement in the Caribbean. And it came to pass as such. So that part of the women's movement is one that I really want to uplift, in that there were these personal relationships that women have with each other that cross borders and boundaries and geographic space, which made a very significant contribution to what became more broader and more intentional via like United Nations or through universities and so on, that here it is these women saw me as a young woman who would go to a university, going to a university would equip me to come back and help other women. And I was at a crossroads in my life at that time because I I was going to Wellesley College in the United States. I had been accepted. I knew that I wanted some tools, I wanted some skills to reflect, to write, and so on. And then I had this opportunity to go to Europe, and I chose to go to Europe because I felt that my access to Europe would have been less likely than my access to the United States. So that is part of the
Your
journey that I think
your
is very
access to you
important.
chose to go to Europe because your access to go to Europe would be less likely than to go to the United States. So you chose there
Yes,
because you didn't know when you would get this opportunity again. Correct?
right, right,
Okay,
right.
can we back up and let me play Angel's Advocate right now and throw some points out. Oh, hello? Hello. Uh-huh. All right, we're gonna take about 5 more minutes, but we'll try to take 5 more minutes. I wanted to speak specifically to, I try to get really personal on my YouTube channel and to be as authentic as possible when it comes to some of the content that I create. Um, I want to get a little bit deeper into the
Sorry.
back. Sure, no problem. I want to get back into the role of men in this conversation, and I want to do that because um, we speak a lot about women's empowerment and women's upliftment and liberation because there have been some issues clearly that needed to be addressed within um, any given society at any given time when it comes to the role of women's access to certain things, right? So if we look at the United States around this time, it was women's access quite similarly in the Black African communities, very similar to what we experience in Belize, where it was women protecting their families and their loved ones who were up against real civil disobedience or who were being put in a vulnerable situation because they were rebelling against the current situation. Similarly, in the United States, you can say or you can see that women in Black African communities were specifically wanting to get into the movement to have better access to healthcare, education, and opportunities for their children. On the other side, at the same time, women in white communities wanted the right to work or to not have to get married. So while the two movements meshed together to create the women's movement in the United States, both parties were not necessarily coming to the table with the same concern. And I feel like after that, well, not I don't feel like that. What I read or what I understand so far is that when the women's movement was sort of quote unquote over and then came birth control, women in the Black African communities chose to have social care instead of families, which is what ended up creating this single parent household phenomenon where women were going back to school, therefore moving away from home, therefore when and if they had children, they weren't staying with their partners because they could go and work, which was not something that they had much access to before. And that created a breakdown in families. Is that something that is not acknowledged enough, that the breakdown of families came because of the women's movement, because we are afraid as women to say that sisterhood has somehow damaged our societies and communities because we have lost the sense of, well, I'm actually just giving my opinion right now. I know they asked that question. I feel like in some cases it has damaged our family way in our communities because it puts and interestingly, I want to add, because when I think of people like Annabelle, when I think of people like Dr. Ford and my white counterparts, they don't seem to have that problem. But we have, for the most part, statistics show we've chosen the social system over our families. And when I say families, I
That's
mean,
an interesting.
I'm saying, I could be regurgitating this from somewhere, but what I'm seeing more and more is single parent, single mother, raising one or two children by themselves because they believe that they don't need, quote unquote, a man. And our situation was slightly different because you were a widow, but I can definitely see how we would have benefited from a father because of the absence of one. Um, and how that was supplemented in many ways, but you know, um, it's definitely something that I have observed being a married woman now in comparison to doing it by myself. Thoughts?
Interesting. Mm. Well, very interesting points, and
So what I'm saying is that it
I
was very organic. Sorry, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it was very organic because I don't think that the government or anybody as a collective thought that this would happen the way it did. You know what I'm saying? It just kind of evolved that way. But sorry, continue.
mm, yeah, well, it really did not evolve that way. One of the
Okay.
things that I appreciate about doing women's studies
Uh-huh.
is that we got information, systematic information about intentionality of capitalism,
Okay.
so on, and economic systems. So
Okay.
when I was sharing with you that white women could align with the enslaved, it's
Mhm.
because these things were entrenched in law. And
Mhm.
that's one of the reasons why I am doing law,
Mhm.
because it gives one the factual information of the mindset
Mhm.
of people who want to be in control.
Mhm.
And so it's not any emotional thing that I have developed. It's just that it is what it is. So you have people like Rosa Luxemburg, who did a formula, for example, of women's work and
Mhm.
women's contribution,
Mhm.
which, if it were to be measured, countries could not function or exist. She was an economist.
Okay.
And the other thing is that, so I was very enlightened to study the plight of women in Europe and the United States,
Mhm.
because it showed me alliances of structures and systems that are
Mhm.
not accidental. So that is
Mhm.
what happened in the United States, where even the president of the United States, President Adams, when they were doing the Declaration of Independence, his wife wrote him a letter when they were doing the declaration, telling him not to forget the women in
Mhm.
this declaration. And his response to her was like with a scoff. I mean, how absurd could that get? So
Mhm.
that gave me a clarity about these systems. And so in these systems, and I'm learning much more now than I did earlier on because I'm taking the time to study
Mhm.
the uh, enslaved, that is the African Americans' history, were brought to the Americas as property.
Mhm.
And so the concept of family and all that kind of good stuff would have been a luxury that they could not afford. So
Okay.
over the years of emancipation and all of that, that maintain it manifests itself in the structures and the systems of the United States and even in our countries as well.
Mhm.
I mean, I am doing law and it just baffled. I mean, I'm just like flabbergasted at these archaic.
Oh. Oh, that is very sensitive.
If
Like
you,
I just pushed it back and it just went off. Like if you can you repeat that, I just moved my computer a few centimeters and you went off.
yeah, I
Like
know. I know what you mean. So what I'm saying is that I am just so flabbergasted at these archaic laws
mhm, mhm.
that are still
But Okay, well then let's talk.
Functional.
Let's do a part two, because I want to also unpack, like,
Yeah.
if we move past slavery, there was a time where people of Black African descent were marrying. I'm talking about Jim Crow time. I'm talking about the civil
Yeah.
rights movement time. We were a family oriented folk. Even,
No.
even, hang
No.
on a
That's
not
that's the point
not
I'm making. That I
but
will.
hang on a second. Hang on a second. I'm talking about, not we. I'm talking about in African American history. You had the time of
Mm,
slavery, but I am talking about, when I say recent, I'm not talking about 1930, 1940. Well, I am talking about, yeah, I'm talking about that time from the 1930s up. People were
right.
marrying. I'm not talking about slavery
Yeah.
time, during the time of that time. I'm
Okay.
talking
Well,
about when
that's
we
okay,
had
and
the
that's good.
chance to marry, we married. But that is no
So
longer the
I
case. And
agree.
yeah, so that's a whole thing that
So
needs to
I'm
be
just
unpacked,
saying that
because right. But what I'm saying,
the
that when,
laws have been structured in a way that marriage is not encouraged. So, like, the point I want to make is that
well,
it is
let's
to the
unpack.
advantage for the woman to be single than
Right,
to be married. So even when
right,
she's married,
right,
she have to hide
right.
the fact that she's married
Right,
because
right,
the
right.
system
Exactly,
that is put.
exactly.
All right, so you got it right.
So that did
You
that
got
was
it.
that when did that happen?
It has happened. Well, I can do my research and give you a specific time in
I
part
could
two,
tell you.
but the
This
only point
happened
that I'm
after the
making.
women's movement.
No, the point I want to make, yes, well, as it is, that the women's movement in the United States would be a different conversation.
Okay.
And the point I'm making is that these structures have always facilitated no family
Right.
gathering union. That's my point. The
Okay.
structures,
Okay.
not just for African Americans, you
Right.
know, for any woman, it has been set up like that, that marriage is not encouraged, as it is evidenced in the laws and
Mhm.
social welfare and social services. You understand what I'm saying? And even institutions like churches and so on,
Mhm.
that would want to force you into marriage or accepting a way of life
Mhm.
that is not necessarily authentic in terms of the rites of passage as you would bring it through,
Mhm.
So I think that's a very important point to focus on by itself, um, and because it maneuvers and manipulates relationships in a way
Mhm.
that really makes men feel, and this is what men have said to me, they feel
Mhm.
cornered, they
Mhm.
feel boxed in,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
disadvantaged.
Mhm.
Um, and I had a very
Do-
interesting conversation with some of my hosts the other night about domestic violence,
Mhm.
that they were giving case after case of how a woman just has to scream and say that you hit her, and the man is arrested.
Right. Right.
Literally.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
the
That there.
laws work.
Yeah. There are actually some
And
interesting
I'm not
statistics
justifying.
about, like, half of 60% of domestic violence cases are false claims.
That's right.
That is very, I mean, as a survivor, I am very, very shocked and hurt by such statistics, because now you can understand why women who actually are in an abusive situation don't come forward, because the system has been so
Yeah,
warped.
well, that,
But there's a lot of unpacking that
yeah,
needs to happen. So let's do
yes.
a part two, Namu. This has been good, but it's 45
I know,
minutes
no.
already. And I have been told that I need to
Okay.
try to keep these conversations short. If I'm gonna watch Netflix, you wouldn't mind, but I'm not gonna complain today. Alright? Mom,
Okay.
thank you so much for coming on the
Okay.
show. I need to come up with a
Thank
nice,
you.
sexy name and send you this YouTube link so that you could share with your viewers. It's been real and real fun.
All
Thank
right.
you guys for
Thank you.
sticking around and
Okay. Yeah.
weathering this. Wait, not going away, Mom. I just want to sign off on YouTube. If you like
I'm
this,
not going out.
all right. So if you guys like this comment, if you guys like this content, please like and subscribe. Leave your comments down below. And thanks for stopping by. Bye.